Underway.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Lionel Frost. I'm the president of the Economic History Society of Australia and New Zealand. And I want to thank everyone who's presenting and has registered. We've got over 100 registrants, which is fantastic, and a lot of people, I think, presenting at Asia Pacific Economic and Business History conferences for the first time. So welcome to our very friendly conference, and we're looking forward to learning from the work that you're doing. We begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we live and work, those of us in Australia, and in fact, pay our respects to all First Nations people. My sincere hope is that the work we do as scholars provides information, helps in education processes that will not only allow non-Indigenous people, such as myself, to learn from ancient Indigenous wisdom that's, of course, evolved over tens of thousands of years, but also the contribution we make to education. It's my sincere hope that all our work helps to provide opportunities for Indigenous and other First Nations people to live safe, healthy and rewarding lives. So I declare the conference formally open. I do want to thank our host, David Gilchrist from UWA. This is our second attempt to have a conference in Perth. Previous to that, I think it was about 25 years ago, we had a face-to-face over there. We were confident this time last year, David, weren't we, that we'd be able to meet face-to-face, but who can predict what's happening?
I think, as Claire said, the Premier said we're opening on February 3rd, but not which year. So who knows what'll happen?
Yes, indeed. Also want to thank Florian Pockel, who you've been dealing with over the past few weeks. Florian does an amazing job. So all the very smoothly laid out program and the Zoom links, that's Florian's work. Give us a wave, Florian. Give us a wave.
Oh.
Yeah. Let me see. David, anything you want to say about arrangements for the day?
No, other than the session links are obviously on the program. That is the final program rather than the extended program. And very much looking forward to participating. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see. Just a few ground rules. I see just about everyone's done this, but yeah, please keep yourself on mute. If you wish to ask a question, please keep it for the question period at the end. David, will it mess things up with the links if we start session one now?
No, I think go for it.
Yeah, okay. Isabelle, hi.
Hi.
You okay to go? David.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. David, Florian, who is chairing this first session? Do you want me to do it?
I think you are, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, our first session is from Isabelle Cherkesly. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, so yeah, whenever you're ready, Isabelle.
Okay.
You'll have about 20 minutes and then 10 minutes for questions.
I'll just start sharing my screen. Presentation mode. Should be good. Okay. So hi. So I'm Isabelle Cherkesly, and I'm doing a PhD in sociology at Monash University. My research looks at the patterns of marriage of Irish convict women who were transported to Tasmania, otherwise known as Van Diemen's Land, between 1840 and 1853. Before starting, I would like to state that I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So just a little bit of history. So Tasmania was first established in 1803 as a penal colony, and until 1840, all direct ships from Ireland landed in New South Wales. But since New South Wales stopped in 1840, Tasmania would now receive all direct convict ships from Ireland. In 1846, the potato famine hit Ireland, and as a consequence, crime rates rose, and so did the number of individuals sentenced to transportation from Ireland. And in 1853, the convict system ended, and in 1856, Van Diemen's Land was renamed Tasmania. So just a note, just a few key terms which relate to marriage and need to be explained for Tasmania. So for those of you who already work in 19th century Tasmania, you would probably know these words. And for those of you who don't, this will just be a little bit of an indicator because we'll be using these words in the presentation. So on the town is commonly known as a euphemism which could have been used for prostitution, although this is debated, and is often noted on convict records. Permissions to marry are applications that had to be made by convicts still under sentence in order to marry. These permissions could be accepted or refused based on character or otherwise. And levels of freedoms were required throughout the life of a convict. For instance, tickets of leave could be given or granted and could be taken away, and they would give convicts more freedom. So the Irish Convict Women Database includes both quantitative and qualitative data from a range of different sources. The core sample is based on the Shift Cohort database that was built by Rebecca Kippen and Janet McCalman under Founders and Survivors Initiative. But to this, I've added more information to have extensive knowledge on the exact dates of marriages, the exact dates of birth of their children, and the exact dates of deaths, and much more. The core sample of the Irish Convict Women Database includes 2,793 convict women who were selected because they were women, born and convicted in Ireland, and who arrived between 1840 and 1853. The sample is attached to other samples, so it's built as a hierarchical database. One of the other samples is the husband sample, which is for 1,610 Irish women, which I was able to link to a convict husband for whom we know the religion and the place of birth. The story sample is the main qualitative facet of the database. It includes multiple subsamples and individual lives, which were selected to try doing both the analysis and data collection. So as a side note, I'm unable to establish information on the specific police spouses at each time in Tasmania because of the lack of good and complete data from Tasmanian censuses in those years, which would look at both the place of birth of people, the age, and the marital status altogether. So the overall methodology that I use to study marriage in Tasmania is based on a convergent mixed methods approach. In this type of approach, I collect and analyze quantitative and qualitative data simultaneously. For my analysis of intensity and timing of marriage, I use a Cox regression model, the overall proportion to marry, and the medium interval in months between arrival and marriage. The qualitative approach for intensity and timing includes a sample of women who committed a homicide in Ireland and multiple individual convict stories. For my analysis of mixed marriages, I use a logistic regression model and the proportion to marry according if they married a man of the same origin, religion, or age. I also look at the lives of 10 women born in Ulster who married a man in Ulster, and multiple individual convict lives. So why did women marry in 19th century Tasmania? And I will say this is 19th century Tasmania because some of these things aren't quite what we'll see, what we would see today. So marriage in this context had a dual role, but as a place where people needed to create a household, have children, and also as a place where they maintain a household. Marriage had multiple advantages, such as optimizing household chores and giving an additional income. This being of particular importance in the 19th century, given that most women would not have had a high income. It also creates a space which can increase the social status of women, from the fact that women who married in Tasmania would often get more freedom, such as tickets of leave upon marrying, to the fact that unmarried women who were pregnant could also be convicted of having a legitimate child. And by marrying, you would avoid this type of conviction. So, but to gain these benefits, there's also costs to marriage. And what is most often seen in marriage is this trend for positive assortative mating, which is a trend to marry similar individuals, and which is theorized that they try to lower the cost by doing this. So similar individuals will have lower quote unquote costs, as once in the marriage, individuals will have less cultural barriers between spouses and will need to adapt less to their spouses. To look at mixed marriages in Tasmania, the first thing I did was test if we saw positive assortative mating. So given the issues with census data and my inability to create an actual pool of spouses, one way to test assortative mating was to look at the province of birth of women and the province of birth of husbands. Then I would compare it to the overall sample. So for Leinster, Munster, and Connacht, the proportion of women from each of these provinces who married men of the same province was always higher than the overall proportion of women from Ireland who married a man from this province. And this is just for women who married an Irishman. But for Ulster, the proportion was slightly lower, if not almost the same. So overall, most women did prefer men from the same province, but not women from Ulster. So the question was, why not? So my first idea was to look at the time at which women from Ulster arrived, because they arrived at an earlier time when less men from Ireland would have been in the pool of spouses. But when I tested a model which separated the sample by time of arrival, I didn't actually find that this reduced the link between being born in Ulster and marrying a man of the same province. Ulster women also had a long history of being exposed to the Protestant culture and the English culture. And so my second idea was to look at if women from Ulster had married more men from England or from outside of Ireland. But actually there was no link between women from Ulster and marrying more men from England. There was no preference in that way. And given this, I thought I should look at the lives of the 10 women from Ulster who married a man from Ulster and see if there was anything unique about these marriages that could actually explain what was happening. And to look at that, we'll look at the stories of two Margarets, Margaret Lee and Margaret Kennedy, and what they kind of tell us about the Ulster woman. So we have the story of two Margarets. Both women are Catholic. They married a Catholic man who was born in the same county. They were both thieves and married a thief. Margaret Lee married Terence Lynch. Both spouses had family members who had been previously transported in Tasmania. And Margaret Kennedy married John Murphy, both spouses having been previously married and had children in Ireland. Margaret Kennedy and John had 7 children in Tasmania and had an overall successful marriage. Margaret Lee and Terence Lynch didn't actually have children. They also can be found to be suing each other in court quite frequently, especially in 1854, where there were events at the Ship's Inn where Margaret Lee says that Terence actually was violent physically to her, whilst Terence said that it was actually Margaret who was drunk and who was being very violent to him. So we know that after those altercations, Margaret Lee and Terence Lynch actually separate, and Margaret left for the mainland whilst Terence remarried and had quite a successful life in Hobart as a merchant. And whilst we would expect that Margaret Kennedy's story and her marriage to John would be more typical because they're closer and usually closer spouses are meant to have better marriages, quote unquote, what we actually find is that Margaret Kennedy and John Murphy are very, very unique. Almost all the stories of these women, I could find evidence of them having issues in their marriages, which was very unique when I was looking at marriages, because I couldn't really trace that much about marriages for other women except for this sample for some reason. And another thing is, of all these women, Margaret Kennedy is the only one who had a child that lived past infancy from her marriage. So all the other women, some of them had children, but none of the children from those marriages actually survived infancy. And in other cases, some women, most of the children they had were not from their actual marriages. So one explanation could be that Ulster women were a minority within the Irish minority, so they could have preferred marrying a man from another province in order to better integrate into society. But despite this, more work does need to be done on this topic to find why Ulster women did not prefer Ulster men. But overall, we can say that with the exception of Ulster women, most women would have preferred marrying a similar man. So we'll now look at the three topics of access, value, and desirability as it relates to marriage. The access to the marriage market is about if a woman is physically, legally, and mathematically able to find a spouse. Although women who had ended their sentences had less restrictions to marry, being no longer in the sentence was not linked to the hazard of marriage, most women marrying before the end of their sentence. Women who were incarcerated at any time were 10 times less likely to marry, and they lacked the capacity to be on the marriage market. Time also had an impact on marriage through both legal considerations and the pool of spouses. So women living later or who had arrived later had a higher hazard of marriage. This is likely because in the later time period, the system started to be less and less systematic, and they would have found it easier to get a permission to marry granted. These women also had an increased likelihood of marrying a man born in Ireland or of the similar religion, as more and more Irish Catholic men were transported and available on the marriage market. Given that the majority of men on the marriage market were also English and Protestant women actually had odds of marrying a man of the same religion, which increased by a factor of 18 compared to Catholic women. Married women in Ireland, so women who had arrived married in Tasmania, were 0.6 times as likely as single women to marry in Tasmania, mostly because bigamy was illegal, but married women could also lie about their status by claiming a dead husband and gain access to marriage in that way. The marital status was actually not linked to mixed marriages. Value on the marriage market is evaluated through both the capacity of women to be a good wife, produce children, and to care for and maintain a household. Younger women had a higher likelihood of marriage in Tasmania as they were seen as more fertile. Despite younger women having a higher value, older women had a higher odds of marrying similar men, probably because it could wait longer to find a similar mate. Character would also be linked to marriage. I tested character through the type of crime in Ireland, prior crimes in Ireland, having been on the town, and crimes committed in Tasmania, which were both separated according to if they were related to alcohol or sexuality. Reoffending and sexual crimes were not related to the overall intensity of marriage. Nonetheless, women who were on the town had lower odds of marrying a similar mate, and women who had a sexual crime had lower odds of marrying a mate of the same religion. This suggested that whilst this aspect of character did not impact the intensity of timing of marriage, it did impact the choices made. Crime in Ireland also had an impact on marriage. So livestock thieves, which have been described as of better character, had a higher intensity of marriage and married more similar mates, whilst violent criminals also had a higher intensity of marriage. But this result for violent criminals did seem counterintuitive, as violent criminals are often seen as being of a worse character. So to better understand why violent criminals had a higher hazard of marriage, I isolated the 17 women in my sample who were convicted of intentional homicide. By looking at their lives, I found commonalities. Most of these women had a low number of prior offenses. Few had been on the town, and most had been subjectively evaluated as good by colonial officers. This all indicated that they had a good character, which contradicts our stereotype of violent criminals. Yet another possibility came to light, which was that women of better character were not more likely to be violent criminals, but that violent criminals were more selected than others to be of a better character. The selection can be seen in the story of Eliza McKelvey. Eliza McKelvey was a prostitute in Ireland, and one day while drunk, she killed her fellow prostitute with a stool. Initially, Eliza was sentenced to be hung, but her sentence was changed to transportation to life. Eliza McKelvey was seen as well-behaved, and this clemency would in part have been linked to her character and the consideration that she was drunk when the murder happened. Given that women convicted of intentional homicide would have been more likely to be sentenced to death than to transportation, transportation would have been seen as a mercy for these women, and only the best behaved would have gained access to transportation. Thus, crime is not a direct indicator of character, as prior selection of women would have been different according to the type of crime she had committed. A third aspect of marriage is about the desire to marry. In other words, some events or statuses can increase the benefits of marriages. Whilst having children was expected to increase the desire of women to marry, as they would need a spouse to care for their children, I actually found no relation between having children or marriage, and this was tested both as children brought on board the boat, children born in the colony, both as a dichotomous and a number of children variable. Women who were pregnant at any point in time did have a higher hazard of marriage. This could either be because they needed to marry in order to avoid some of the negative consequences of having a child outside of marriage, or it could be because they were already engaged, got pregnant, and then married. Women who were pregnant at the same time as they got married had actually lower odds of being married to men of the same religion. Whilst this could be because they were more in a rush and therefore less selective, it could also be because the churches were less likely to marry women if they were pregnant. And whilst being pregnant had an impact on the religion of spouses, it actually did not have an impact on the origin of spouses. Having a longer sentence also increased the overall hazard of marriage. Women with longer sentences had increased benefits from marriage, as marrying early would cut a higher number of years from their sentence, proportionally to women with shorter sentences. But sentence length was not linked to the origin or religion of spouses. So the previous presentation has looked at three aspects of marriage: access, value, and desire. By using a mixed method, I was able to better illustrate some of the concepts and ask new questions. An interesting observation was that whilst indicators of a worse character had little impact on the overall intensity of marriage, it was actually highly related to the choices made on the marriage market. Although character was evaluated through offenses, there is a lot that is unknown about this indicator, and character could change over time. The Irish Convict Women Database is an ongoing database which will be used in the future to study both fertility, mortality, and criminality once it's in its final form. The next part of my research will look at recidivism in marriage. I'll be able to look more intensely at what was a good or bad marriage and how assortative mating worked. I also wish to thank everyone who has helped me with this project, from my supervisors to the database providers. So that includes everybody from the FAS, the SCRC, acknowledgement of Tahoe, Trove, all the historical archives out there that have helped me create this database, because without all your work, I wouldn't be able to be presenting this kind of work. So there's been a lot of help out there. And if you wish to get full printouts of my regression models or asking me more questions about what you saw today, please send me an email and I'll be happy to discuss this with you. And you can have my Twitter ID right there, although I don't really use it. So, but happy for you guys to use it. So thank you. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. That's a, excuse me, that's a wonderful start to the conference, and yeah, much applause. Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I think the best way to go is if you could raise your hand on your screen, and I'll try and keep track of who's first. So who would like to start us off, please? Can I start then, please? Isabelle, I'm just curious, just wondering what stage you're at. This is a PhD, correct? Yeah. Just wondering, just tell us what stage you're at and what you're hoping to do down the track.
Yeah, so I'm basically in the last year of the PhD, so I'm hoping to submit in September. And hopefully down the track, I'll be able to keep on going in academia and keep working with those historical databases from Tasmania and from the rest of Australia about convicts, and also extend that both in the 19th and 20th century. Yeah.
Okay, good. Annika has a question. Go ahead, Annika.
Just a question for Isabelle. Have you looked yet at the effect of marriage from convict women to maybe free men in order for the convict women to obtain their own freedom in society?
Yeah, so I tried to actually identify if there were any free husbands at the time of marriage. The issues were that a lot of men that were actually, who arrived as convicts on board, as soon as they got their tickets of leave or were considered to be out of their sentences, were written as free men on the permissions to marry. So that was a bit of an issue. The other thing to consider is I was actually able to link, I think it was about 75% of convict women to a convict husband. So there would have been very few that would have married a quote unquote free man. But in my hope is that if we do more on recording the arrivals of migrants and having more work done so that we can identify these free men, then I'll be actually able to link them up. But for now, I haven't actually been able to do that. I only found like one free husband really when I was able to identify them.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Now we have a question from Deb Oxley. Thank you, Deb, for staying up so late.
Well, actually, I'm not staying up late. I now live in Australia.
Oh, really?
Oh.
My apologies. Well, that's even better. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Lionel. Thanks, Isabelle. That was a very interesting piece. I was going to ask you to think beyond your data and reflect on an old debate in Australian history about whether the sex ratio tips the balance considerably in favour of women or not. Because the original argument was that women, because they were few in number, were actually disadvantaged, which is counterintuitive for people who believe in supply and demand. So if you could tell us any thoughts you have on what the sex ratio does to women, Irish women in the marriage market in Tassie, and if you're going to relate it to options if they remained in Ireland. Thank you.
Yes, so there is a lot about the sex ratio, and from what I've seen, the sex ratio would have advantaged women quite a lot, because most women in my sample, so I think it was about 90% actually got married in Ireland. Not Ireland, Tasmania, sorry. My brain did a little bit of a oopsies there. So most of them actually married in Tasmania, and most of them married within 2 years. So it would have been very, very advantageous for women. I think definitely when they arrived in Tasmania, what they would have been given was a much better opportunity of marrying compared to what they had in Ireland, especially after the famine. Because after the famine, you get all that these issues with the new economy being now more based on having really large amount of land, and then women can't really marry. So I do see it more as an advantage, and it actually was kind of a quote unquote blessing in disguise, that I say, for them, because they could have had now husbands and married and have families. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Dean has a question.
Yeah, thanks again, Isabelle. That was really interesting. I suppose my question also kind of somewhat follows on from Deb's, just wondering what the kind of overall population composition was in Ireland. So what it was, the sex ratio, and do Irish people here represent the majority in Tasmania or the minority?
Yeah, so definitely the proportion of convicts from Ireland compared to the overall population in Tasmania would have been quite low. I think one of the papers I read, or one of the books I read, said that by the end of the 1890s, there was only 1.7% of people in Tasmania that were both parents were Irish. So it would have been quite low, and there was a lot of mixing. But yeah, as I said, they definitely had an advantage coming here because they had more spouses, more possibilities of marrying. So yeah, I think there was just so many Englishmen on the marriage market that it was just too easy for them to marry an Englishman instead of an Irishman, really. But they still preferred the Irishman.
Yeah. But we don't have sort of strict statistics on what that is, or not really available?
No, it's unfortunately the census data really, what they did was they had were you born free in the colony, come from somewhere else, but they didn't have the place they were coming from. And then also the migrant data for Tasmania barely recorded anything in the end for the aggregates that were being published. So for New South Wales, you got a lot of details. You have the places where they were coming from, you got the ages, the sex, and then from Tasmania is just the number that arrived this year. So it's quite unfortunate, but it's what we have right now.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you.
Okay.
Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, Isabelle. Incredibly rich data set and a really nice presentation. My question, though, I guess, is coming from economics. You know, I'm aware of although I don't work in the area myself, the huge literature on the with matching models of marriage and human capital models of marriage and all that sort of thing. I'm just wondering the extent to which you've engaged with that literature, and I wonder that even if you don't want to do that sort of modeling, because after all, you're doing a PhD in sociology, and you're probably looking to publish in sociology journals for that reason. But I wonder whether from some of those frameworks might help you to put together some of the lists of factors that you've got there. So rather than just a list of factors that affect something, it lets you see the relationships between the factors and put them in a larger framework. So I'm not suggesting you do sort of the mathematical modeling that goes on in the economics literature, but I wonder whether some of those conceptual frameworks might help to put things together, particularly the relationships between some of those factors you've identified. So I guess I was just wondering whether your reactions to the economics literature and whether you think it might be at all helpful in what you're doing.
Yeah, so actually a large part of my thesis is built upon Becker's theory of new household economics. So that's one of the main theories I'm using as a narrative through the thesis. I won't be doing, as we said, the actual advanced mathematical modeling in the actual thesis, but definitely a large part of it is adapted from Becker and his theories around how households are built and the cost to benefit kind of ideas there. So it's definitely a big part of the thesis is that, yeah.
Oh, sure. We obviously got part of your thesis, and I haven't read the rest of it. So
That's
it
fine.
sounds like you have done that. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, we need to call time on this session. Isabelle, that was a very interesting and terrific start, and all the best for completion of your thesis. And I hope now you can relax and enjoy the rest of the conference. So,
Thank you.
Can we thank Isabelle, please?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Dean, you're up next.
Thank you, Isabelle, for the high bar set. All right, let me go ahead and share.
Again, about 20 minutes, please, Dean, and yep, away you go.
Everyone can see that, yes? Thank you, Lionel, and thank you to the organisers of the conference for having me and giving me the opportunity to present my work. It's my first time presenting here. I'm very excited. So I'll be presenting my paper, The Temperature of the Melting Pot, Cultural Assimilation and Environmental Similarity During the Age of Mass Migration, which will represent sort of chapter 1 of my PhD thesis in economics. So we know immigration is an incredibly contentious issue throughout the Western world, and cultural assimilation really kind of lies at the heart of this issue. And beliefs around cultural assimilation of immigrants, in particular sort of concerns of an inability or somehow incompatibility with the native culture, have consistently been shown to be the most influential factors in determining public support for immigration restrictions. So it's been a real increase in interest and importance in understanding the mechanisms and determinants of cultural assimilation rates for both economists and for policymakers in general. Yet despite this increase in interest, the mechanisms still remain quite poorly understood. And in particular, the role of origin factors remains particularly understudied, even though we do see considerable heterogeneity in the rates based on immigrant origin. And a large part of this is due to data constraints, namely that there's a lack of migrant origin data in these kind of longer data sets. Either they're insufficiently granular, they're unreliable, or they're simply non-existent. So I propose the role of environmental similarity, which I define as kind of the difference between an immigrant's destination environment and, their origin environment and their destination environment, and what role that plays in determining rates of cultural assimilation. And how I overcome these data constraints is by linking Ellis Island passenger manifest data to US Census data during the age of mass migration. And in doing so, I construct the most extensive data set to date, which is linking migrant origin to destination and further assimilation outcomes. So a brief background on what the age of mass migration is and why we are sort of using this to provide insights for cultural assimilation today. So it's this seminal period between roughly 1850 to 1920, where over 30 million Europeans migrated to the United States. So that's considered the largest voluntary mass migration in history. And the concept of, and the metaphor of this melting pot is actually where, during this period is where this metaphor originated. And it's this idea that migrant assimilation during this period was incredibly quick and painless, and these migrants sort of assimilated into society very quickly. However, in reality, there were similar concerns over an inability to assimilate and similar kind of nativist movements to those that we see today at the time. And they actually led directly to widespread immigration restrictions in the 1920s, which effectively ended the age of mass migration. So one big advantage of studying this area is that we can draw a lot of parallels between the two. And indeed, studies have shown that many of the assimilation patterns and the migration patterns are quite similar to those that we see today. However, the main advantage really is data, this idea that we're seeing newly digitized data sets, improved linking techniques between data sets. And it really provides this kind of incredible opportunities to creating these new long-term historical panels. And that provides the ability to do these detailed long-term analysis of assimilation, which really isn't possible for immigration today. So this is why we're studying this period. And indeed, this has become an a very popular area to be studying. And a number of significant determinants have been found of cultural assimilation. So on an individual level, several have been found, such as English proficiency, military service. We also see determinants on a community level, so the levels of discrimination a community faces, African-American internal migration, enclave residents have all been studied. However, what we see is that none of these really provide a lot of insight about why we see this origin level heterogeneity, and really no origin level determinants have really ever been studied. And so this is where I introduce environment and culture as a potential origin level determinant. So it's increasingly understood that there is a close link between environment and culture, and a number of environmental metrics have been found to have important influences on culture. So just to name a few: seasonality, climate instability, ruggedness, geographic accessibility, plow suitability, all these different areas. And this is where I bring in environmental similarity. As I mentioned, the difference in environment between origin and destination for migrants, because these previous studies, they're only looking at environmental characteristics for the native population. There's not really an idea at the moment about how a change in environment may affect cultural change and in turn cultural assimilation. So ex ante, it isn't exactly clear what direction that might go in. So, and what sort of through which mechanisms we might see that environmental similarity might impact cultural assimilation. So on the one hand, it is closely related, at least we know anecdotally, to the psychological shock of migration. So the greater this environment change, the greater the shock. And we know that from many historical accounts. But again, this isn't clear how this might affect cultural assimilation. On the one hand, it may cause migrants to cling tighter to their old traditions. On the other hand, it may leave them more open to cultural change. And on the other hand, we know that environmental similarity is closely related to economic activities, economic productivity. So to what extent does your new environment allow you to continue your traditional lifestyle? So if you're a farmer from Sicily and you come over, there's very little opportunities for you to continue that. And that's another mechanism that we might see, because we know that economic activities are closely linked to cultural practices as well. So a number of key contributions for this paper. In the area of cultural assimilation, this is the first empirical analysis of these origin level determinants of cultural assimilation. I also introduce a novel measure of cultural assimilation, which we'll discuss later. Contributing to the area of environment and culture, first quantitative study looking at this changing environment, not static environment. And of course, one of the key data sets, key contributions being this data set. So it's quite ambitious. We're linking the entire universe of male migrants to come through Ellis Island during this real peak period of the age of mass migration. So looking at the period 1892 to 1920. And we are looking at an incredibly extensive, incredibly granular data set, which is not just linking for one country, but for the entirety of Europe during this period. So how do we do this? So the first key data set is, of course, the US Census data. I use full count 1920 US Census as the main source. I'm still awaiting access to the full, it's restricted. So still jumping through a few hoops there. So for this preliminary results, we're just looking at a 1% sample, but eventually that will be scaled up. From this US Census, we get, we're calculating this destination environmental data at the county level. So this is going to be the main geographic unit we're looking at. There's about 3,000 counties in the US, so it's fairly granular. And also from the US Census, we're going to be using given names and household linkages, so linking parents to their children. And that's going to provide us the main measure of cultural assimilation, which will be this name assimilation rate. So child naming measures have been quite popular in this kind of literature as a measure of cultural assimilation for a number of reasons. So it's been shown to be a really potent expression of cultural identity. It's very simple to calculate. It's more universal, and it represents pure choice. So what I mean by that is there's very little constraints on what you can name your child. Whereas if we're looking at something like intermarriage rates, that represents both a choice and a constraint in who wants to marry you. So in that sense, it provides more of a choice and so a clearer measure. And this foreignness index is probably the most popular measure. So for any given name, what this gives you is the probability that that name was given by foreign-born parents, right? So that ranges from 0 to 100, 100 being the most foreign. So typically the way this is used is we look at second-generation children, study their names as the outcome variable, and use parental characteristics to sort of determine those determinants of cultural assimilation. However, this is really indirect because the children are not the level where the assimilation is happening, at least not for foreigners index. And it's also subject to fertility bias. So what I mean by that is if a parent has more children, they get more weight in the samples. And we know that fertility is very closely linked to cultural assimilation outcomes. So we're creating bias here potentially. So I propose this name assimilation rate, which is essentially a modification of the foreignness index, as we can see down here. The important difference being the level of the measure is at the father level. And that is the level we're interested in, because when we're talking about naming of children, it's the fathers who are assimilating, not the children. So that's what we're looking at. And so in that sense, it's simpler, it's more direct, has a fairly easy interpretation. So what it's telling you is for every extra year you spend in the US, so this is a kind of measure of exposure. For every extra year you spend in the US, what is the average decrease in the foreignness index for children relative to your own? So it's essentially measuring how quickly immigrant fathers are converging to these native naming patterns. So if your NAR is 2, it means after 10 years in the country, your children born 10 years after you arrive typically have 20 points less on this index scale. So here's a quick sort of distribution of named foreigners between fathers and their children, so immigrant fathers and their children. So we do see a fairly wide range. Also, we do see a distinct decrease. So the average does decrease from 62 to 50. So on average, people are assimilating. The other important thing to note is we're getting a clearly non-normal distribution here. And so if we're using foreignness index directly as an outcome variable, we're going to have issues with the inference. And this is the distribution of the name assimilation rate of our sample. So we can see the vast majority of people have a positive NAR, which means they are assimilating. However, there are a non-negligible amount that are negative assimilation. The mean being about 2.5, which doesn't sound like a lot, but again, this is a 25-point decrease after only 10 years in the country. So that is a pretty substantial assimilation rate. And again, we can see that this is a fairly normal distribution. So that's going to give us more peace of mind when we use this as an outcome variable. And so when we start to break this down by place of origin, we see the same heterogeneity that we see with other measures. So certain areas assimilate much faster than others. So in this case, we're seeing Scandinavians and Northern Europeans typically assimilating faster, and perhaps unsurprisingly, English-speaking countries assimilating slower. However, again, there's no real kind of clear pattern here as to why we're seeing this heterogeneity. And again, for this, we need sort of finer, more reliable origin level data. This is pretty coarse, and for various reasons, these country associations are not super reliable. So this is where this Ellis Island passenger manifest data comes in. So between 1892 and 1924, this was the main immigration station, and it processed the vast majority of European migration in this time, so over 90%. There's over 24 million passenger manifest entries, and I extract all unique male European migrants from freely available databases. So this is going to be 6.6 million individuals. So here's just a quick look at what this manifest looks like. The squares in red are the ones that have been digitized by the Church of Latter-day Saints. What's going to be key for this analysis is this last residence. That's what's going to give us this granular origin level data. And this is what's going to be typically recorded at like a town or municipality level, so quite granular. This is very complete, very meticulously kept, and has been shown to be quite closely linked to actually place of birth. And I'm going to geolocate these to the main historic administrative region, which I'm going to be calling province. So that's essentially the largest subnational administrative region, of which there are about 700 in Europe. Only one paper has previously used, to the best of my knowledge, the entire full count data set. And that's the Bonjera et al. Paper, 2013. And that's without any linking though. So this is the first paper to really utilize the whole of Europe for this. So we've seen it used subnational at national level. So people have used this for Italy or for Norway, but this is the first to really use it for the whole of Europe. So fairly ambitious project. Brief overview of the construction process. So we have these two data sets, as I mentioned, from Ellis Island, we're geolocating this province of origin. We're using environmental rasters to attribute origin level characteristics of each of the provinces. And we're going to do the same on the 1920 US Census side. So the county of residence is recorded, so no need to geolocate. And we're going to do the same to obtain this destination environmental characteristics. And as mentioned before, the 1920 census is also going to give us our name assimilation rate. The key issue here is going to be linking these two. So linking individuals from these shipping records to the US Census. And that's probably the most challenging part because we're going to need to link them to get this measure of environmental similarity, this difference between your origin and destination environmental characteristics. So this has been an increasing area of increasing interest. A lot of challenges though, common names, name changes, transcription errors, missing data. There's going to be a lot of issues here. But analysis of these kind of techniques have shown they perform quite well. But what we do see is a clear trade-off between accuracy and efficiency. So accuracy being what percentage of your matches are correct, and efficiency being what's essentially your match rate. So what percentage of your whole observations are you matching? And so the more aggressive you are at increasing your match rate, you're going to have to sacrifice some level of accuracy. So for this paper, I'm going to use a two-pronged approach utilizing two different methods. So Ferry 1996 and Abramitsky, Bustan and Erickson 2012 methods. It's going to involve exact surname matching, but then on the first name allow for phonetic name roots and string distances, and also linking on age and year of immigration. So these phonetic name roots and string distances allow sort of account for some name changes, so slight name Americanizations. It allows for transcription errors, sort of minor ones. And in doing so, this sort of increases the efficiency rate. But the exact surname is key because surnames have been shown to be highly regional specific. And so by keeping exact surnames, I can be really aggressive in the other areas and it increase the efficiency, but therefore the decreased accuracy comes with pretty minimal measurement error. The reason being, if I match the wrong person, they have the same surname though. So therefore they're highly likely to still be from the same region. And in doing so, fairly minimal, hopefully fairly minimal measurement error. So in my 1% census sample, there are roughly 44,000 males who have immigrated from Europe in this time. So about 4.2% of the total population. And this algorithm successfully matches 4,500 of them roughly. So it's a 10.3% match rate, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this really is a significant improvement on previous studies trying to match foreigners, which is about 4 to 6% match rate. But it is significantly worse than matching natives. And the reason being that foreigners are simply much harder to match. They change their names significantly more, and there's a lot more transcription errors with their names because they have more unfamiliar names. So here's just a quick map detailing all the geolocated places of residence for the matched sample. So we can see we get a pretty wide geographic distribution, certainly areas of concentration as we would expect. So Italy, Ireland, England, Scandinavia, Northern Europe is going to be particular areas of concentration. I guess the key question when it comes to these kind of matching algorithms is the place of origin going to be balanced? So are we getting a good composition of the actual sample? And just looking at this, it's fairly unbalanced. The blue being the proportion in the census, whereas the red is the matched proportion. We can see that Italians, Russians, Poles are going to be significantly underrepresented, and English, Irish, to some extent Swedish as well, overrepresented. And that's simply a feature that Italians, Russians, and Poles have more foreign names, and so they're harder to match. They're more likely to change their names, and they're going to have more unfamiliar names. And so both in the data entry side, and then the digitization side, we see more errors coming in. And there's not really much you can do about that. In terms of the matching algorithm, there's always going to be some level of imbalance when you're trying to match foreigners. But I do control for some of the characteristics that come from this. So accounting for English speaking, foreigners index, potential income differences, things like that. I also use inverse probability weights on these. So assigning higher probability for these probability weights for these areas that are underrepresented. And they do show that they suggest that the results are not driven by the balance in the matching. Nevertheless, I think the results should be interpreted as average treatment effect on the match sample, not average treatment effect overall. That said, I make an argument that the estimates I do come up with are likely lower bound estimates for the average treatment effect. The reason being, if we think of the areas that are overrepresented, the English-speaking areas, they were much slower to assimilate and generally had fairly similar environments, whereas somewhere like Italy has very fast or much faster assimilation and generally much greater environmental difference. And so when we see the results, we're going to see that it's likely that these are lower bound estimates. So now that we've constructed these two, linked these two, we can construct these environmental similarity measures. As I mentioned, they're just going to be the absolute value of the difference in different environmental metrics. So we're going to use climatological ones, annual mean temperature, and rainfall.
Dean, just a couple of minutes, please.
Okay. We'll skip through this.
Yep. Okay. Cheers.
Empirical strategy is going to start baseline, going to be simple OLS. So we've got the outcome variable, environmental similarity. So beta 1 is going to be coefficient of interest, vector of individual controls, such as foreigners index, years in the US, age of arrival, things like that. We're going to use county fixed effects to account for potential county invariant characteristics, and standard error is going to be clustered at the county level. Of course, we're going to have some self-selection issues, so we need instrumental variable here. So we're going to instrument environmental similarity with what I call predicted environmental similarity. Essentially, it's a weighted average share based off previous immigrant proportion. So it's got the flavor of kind of a shift share instrument, simply the fact that immigrants are going to follow other immigrants. And so I can use this kind of counterfactual, let's say you move to this area, weighted by the share of what's the probability that you actually move to that area. The important thing is this is going to be highly correlated with environmental similarity, but by construction invariant to the actual migrant settlement choice. So we shut down that level of variation. There's also potential origin level confounders. So we're going to use country of origin fixed effects to account for those. Breeze through the results because they're very preliminary at this stage anyway. I'm only working with a 1% sample. But the basic underlying thing is that when we break it down by urban rural, we see that the effects we're seeing are only at the rural level, and they're typically at the level of crop suitability, which would suggest that the mechanism we're seeing is through economic means rather than any kind of psychological effects from greater share. However, when we run this with the IVs, they are still positive and high, but there's still issues with the IV. These estimates are unrealistic, most likely due to this very small sample. So we'll see once I get the full sample if we can fix this instrument. We also don't see any origin selection effects. So in conclusion, this increase in digitization, improved techniques have really opened up this wealth of opportunity for constructing these new historical panels to answer questions that previously were simply unanswerable. One of them being, why do we see this origin level heterogeneity? So I overcome this by constructing the first Europe-wide data set linking the universe of male immigrants during this really seminal period of migration. Preliminary results at this time suggest that immigrants moving to culturally unfamiliar areas assimilate significantly faster, but we really need sort of full sample level to kind of break this down more, break down the sample to investigate mechanisms. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Could you stop your screen share, please? Now, if anyone has any questions from anyone, who would like to start us off? Isabelle.
Hi, so interesting presentation. Just a few nitpicks, questions.
Yep.
Just one thing, you said the name assimilation was on the father level, but so this first question is the fact that Spanish conventions were more about the mother's name. That's one thing. And the other thing is just something that I've seen when I was working in the 1831 census of Canada, is that oftentimes wheat, barley, and those crops that were very similar were actually counted together by farmers, because they would mix them up and then they wouldn't account correctly for which one of them was actually wheat, which one of them was actually barley. So just looking at if you're considering that within your data too.
Great questions. On the name assimilation rate, we're just looking at first names, not any surname stuff. Certainly different things you need to do to make sure you are kind of picking up those kind of measures. I suppose the thing to note, which I think causes some confusion, is what does it really mean for name assimilation, particularly for English-speaking migrants? Like, how can they name assimilate? We're not really talking about name foreigners in terms of like anglicizing names or things like that. We're just talking about patterns of native. So native, we're talking about Americans have very distinct naming patterns, and they're quite different from other English-speaking countries. So for example, things like Frank and Carl are really popular in the US, whereas something like Arthur and Fred are much more popular in the UK. And indeed, a lot of those names are not English. So Carl is not an English name, that's a Germanic name. And so we're seeing how much we're sort of converging to these native naming patterns, and they're only on first names. So I think the Spanish is just last naming conventions, correct? Yeah, so we're just talking about first names. On the crop suitability side, that's exactly the reason I wanted to avoid looking at crop output and things like that. So we're just talking about environmentally. So this is just a binary measure based on soil, different measures from the FAO that's going to be whether or not a crop is commercially viable to produce in that region based off historic agricultural techniques. So it might be that in that region, no wheat is produced at all. And indeed, many of them, that's going to be the case, where a lot of these are cotton growing regions, things like that. But it's just whether, and indeed the same as in Europe, but it's whether you have similar agricultural and environments. So if you want to grow, let's say you've come from a wheat growing area and you go to an area where no one grows wheat, but if you can grow wheat, you could still grow wheat there. You know what I mean? It's whether you can continue to produce what you want to produce, or whether you have to learn new agricultural practices. That's kind of the idea.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions? So Dean, how far along are you in
confirmation?
Confirmation, yeah.
So
excellent, excellent. Yeah, well, good luck with it, and yeah, I hope this has been a helpful experience for you.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
No, pleasure to have you on board, and look forward to further contributions from you. Okay, let's keep things moving. We'll move on to our third paper, and this is from my colleague at Monash in the economics department, Marco Lecci. Hi, Marco.
Hi, Lionel. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Okay, so about 20 minutes, please, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much first for the opportunity. I'm joining Dean as the poll of PhD students in the first stage of confirmation. Let me share my screen here. Can you guys see my slides? Yeah? Okay.
All good, Marco.
Yeah. So let me start on this. Historical anti-fascism and contemporary voting behavior in Italy. So I'm moving with Dean outside of Australia. working on Europe here. And this is an ongoing work with Laura Panza, Exui, and Giulio Zanella. Motivation of the paper: far-right parties had a resurgence, becoming a mainstay in contemporary politics. There is evidence that historical experience in fascist Europe reverberate to political preferences until today. So far, the existing literature highlights historical factors that foster right-wing voting, while in our work, we want to investigate historical factors that reduce the risk of right-wing voting. So for our contribution, we want to study the causal relation between opposition to fascism, recorded in the Casellario Politico Centrale, and right-wing voting between 48 and 2018. So we use a simple economic model to illustrate the cultural transmission and to solve the identification problem. As I mentioned here, the Casellario Politico Centrale is a newly collected individual data dataset on the universe of opponents during the regime, and we manually collected sentences issued by the Tribunale Speciale per la Difesa dello Stato that we used to construct judge fixed effects based on the random assignment of judges, and that will help us solve the empirical identification problem. So an economic model and two newly collected datasets. But before we dig deep into the paper, it's important to understand the historical chronology of all the right-wing parties in Italy. So everything started, the story started with the Partito Nazionalfascista, Mussolini, that fell in 1943, substituted by the orphans of the Partito Nazionalfascista with Movimento Sociale Italiano that lasted until the end of the First Republic in 1992. In fact, in Italy in 1992, there was a political earthquake that shook things around, and Movimento Sociale Italiano transformed into Alleanza Nazionale, a more right-wing party and less extreme right-wing party. Alleanza Nazionale that then joined forces with Forza Italia, the Silvio Berlusconi party, and they created together the Popolo delle Libertà here, that lasted until 2013. And then subsequent to that, the parties split up, and the direct descendant of the Alleanza Nazionale, Movimento Sociale Italiano, is nowadays Fratelli d'Italia. So this is like the background of the political scene in Italy for the right wing. Here we have the results of the general elections from 48 to 2018. As you can see here, we have Movimento Sociale Italiano and Alleanza Nazionale up to 2006, then Forza Italia and Popolo delle Libertà, and then here we have Fratelli d'Italia. So this is just to give you a background. The two newly collected datasets, the first one is the Casellario Politico Centrale. This was founded in 1894 for the first time. It's a kind of catalog where all the opponents to the government were recorded. So before the regime, the liberal governments in Italy used the catalog, the Casellario Politico, to record all the anarchists and the violent socialists at the beginning of the century. But it's just with the regime, with the fascist regime, that this catalog get exploited and used a lot to target political opponents. In fact, we have more than 100,000 individuals that were recorded in the Casellario Politico during the fascist regime, 26 to 43. Of course, having your name there implied continuous police surveillance and different kind of punishment. We have warnings, deportation, listed to the border index, or deferred to this special tribunal. Here we have some summary statistics of the Casellario Politico Centrale. As we can see here, the most common type of political opponent are socialist and communist. The vast majority of individuals were assigned only one crime. There is a change in composition between the first and the second period. There's an increase in the share of dissidents, anti-fascists in the second period, and a decline of the incidence of socialists and communists. This might be due to a change in the labeling in the Casellario Politico Centrale. In the punishment section here is worth mentioning that 14% of the people were referred to the special tribunal in the first period. Being referred to the special tribunal doesn't mean that you were actually tried eventually by the special tribunal. As we can see from the map, the opposition that is computed as the number of opponents per 10,000 adults at a provincial level is higher in the first period than in the second. So that might be due because the regime became stronger, so the opposition goes down. That can be the results of harsher punishment in the second period, or also could be the consequence of repression of early opponents. So in fact, it's possible that punishment during the first period was setting the expectations about what will happen to you if you go against the regime, essentially. The second newly collected data set is, we collected this data manually, is the Tribunale Speciale. We collected more than 8,000 individuals that appear in front of the special tribunal between 27 and 43. Now, it's very important to understand the composition and the functioning of the special tribunal, because that's what we use as our instrument. So the special tribunal was composed of 6 judges. We have 1 president and 5 judges. In total, over the period under consideration and the period where the Tribunale Speciale was working, we have 91 distinct judges. The judicial background was not necessary, and those judges were assigned to cases on a random basis, depending on the variability during the day. So another thing is worth mentioning is that those processes weren't happening at a provincial level. All the people that were referred to the special tribunal were directed to this room in Rome, and that we have here a picture, in Palazzaccio, close to the Vatican. So all the defendants were going there, were sent there, and all the processes were taking place in this room here. As we can see here, we have the panel, and the person, the defendant, was probably waiting here the sentence. Now, to give you a better understanding of how the panel is structured, this is the official paper, the official font of our data. So as you can see here, we have the president here, and the judicial relator is not just the scriber. It's the one that reports everything that it says during the process, but doesn't vote. And then here we have the composition of the panel. Those names here will change on a daily basis based on the variability of the judges. It's important to understand. Here we have like the people that were sentences, randomly allocated to the people, to the judges. So imagine the catalog, the casellario as a big umbrella, and a subset of this big umbrella is the people sent to and referred to the special tribunal. So the OVRA was the special police, was investigated cases, they created a folder, because they have a suspect, they send it to the prosecutor. The prosecutor then will send those folders to either the Giudice Istruttore or the Commissione Istruttoria, composed of 1 judge here and 3 judges here based on the severity. Their role was to either direct the defendant to military tribunals, dismiss the case, or ordinary tribunals. Just the worst cases will end up in front of the special tribunal panel. So this is the special tribunal machine. This is the special tribunal panel. Again, the role of Giudice Istruttore, Commissione Istruttoria, was to filter the cases. The regime was smart. They didn't want to have the public to look too closely how they were targeting opponents, specifically political opponents. So they created this source of filter. And to give you an idea of the severity of the cases that would end up in front of the special tribunal, we had people like Gramsci, the head of the Communist Party in Italy, and Pertini, the head of the Socialist Party in Italy that became president of the Republic, the Italian Republic years later. Here are some of the summary statistics for the Tribunale Speciale. We can notice here an increase in the standard deviation between the first and the second period that will be relevant for our instrument. We'll look more in details to this later. But before we move into the empirical part, it's important to get an understanding of the model. So there is an overlapping generation index at time t. Theta is the state for fascism. So higher value of theta, the more the state for fascism, and through the opposite. Individuals can choose either to oppose to fascism with an expected utility, where pi t is the probability of getting arrested, and st hat is the expected sentence inflicted following the arrest. Individuals can also choose to persecute opponents with this expected utility function, where ct is the cost of persecuting opponents, or that they can choose to do nothing. So we want to generate variation, so we expect that both punishment and cost are fairly high. So, and theta bar is in support of theta as a bounding condition. We're gonna see this in the equilibrium. So the utility of individuals that opposes to fascism has to be as high as the one being natural and the one of persecuting anti-fascists. So the supply of opposition, or the fraction of anti-fascists, simply called, in generation T is given by AT. Opposite for the demand for repression, so the utility for people that opposes to fascism, that must be equal or exceed the one of being natural or that of persecuting anti-fascist. So the supply of the demand for repression, so the fraction of population that engages in repression of opponents to fascism is equal to the arrest rate. To give you an idea, for theta bar, for theta IT that is higher than theta bar, we have anti-fascist, or for theta IT that is smaller than theta bar, we have anti-fascist, active anti-fascist actually. So if we combine 1 and 2, we obtain the equilibrium here. So the equilibrium opposition rate to in the province to fascism. But how do we transfer this anti-fascist culture here? Well, we rely on the literature here. So if we look at the literature, we assume that individual dictates for anti-fascism is determined by family or social influences, friends, for example. So the IT is the socialization effort chosen by parents. And as every parent, they would like their kids to have the same dictate of fascism as they have. So with the quadratic socialization effort, so in the law of motion, phi determines the feminist cost of transmitting this dictate for fascism. If there's high cost, so if phi is costly, if the vertical transmission is costly, then the child dictate for fascism will derive from social influences, so horizontal transmission. The opposite, if direct socialization is low cost, child dictate for fascism will move away from the social influence and will be determined more from parental traits. So we obtain here the law of motion of these states for fascism across generation. So what are the implications of our empirical analysis that we created? Well, we have 2 periods. Time T is time T is before World War II, and time T plus 1 is the period after World War II, the generation after World War II. So YIT plus 1 is the propensity of an individual in the post-war generation to vote for right-wing parties. So here we created a connection between the historical anti-fascism and the right-wing voting that we want to estimate. Now, it's important to highlight that we don't observe the share of anti-fascists, but we observe the share of anti-fascists arrested, the one recorded in the Casellario Politico Centrale. We have a problem here, is that we face an identification problem here because the share of anti-fascists recorded in the Casellario Politico Centrale is determined by a missing equation in our model. So our opposition measure is a conflation of supply and demand. In order for us to solve this identification problem, we can use this class of instrument associated with the expected punishment. So in our case, is the Hesty hat that we saw in the first equation. So any exogenous shock in the Hesty hat induces a variation in the arrest rate that reflects only supply factors, but not the demand factors. This is because if we look back, Hesty hat entered the first equation, but not the second. What are the implications here? So we use judge-fixed effect as an exogenous shock that shifts ST hat and inducing variation in the arrest rate. So we impose a natural timeline. The explanatory variable is opposition rate between 35 and 43, and the instrument is the residual judge toughness in 27-34. How do we construct the judge-fixed effect? It's important to understand that you have in mind what we saw before as how is constructed the panel in the picture. So for each case judged by the panel that we saw before, we regress the years of sentence on year and crime dummies. And that represents as a measure of how tough the judge was, judging panel was in that specific case. We then create for each judge an individual measure of toughness that is given by the average of judge toughness across all the cases that that judge appeared and heard. And then we compute for each province the weighted average of judge toughness experienced by the defendant from that specific province across all judges. And we obtain the average residual judge toughness. As we can see here, the judge fixed effect is higher in the second period than in the first period, and this is in line with the standard deviation that we saw in the summary statistics that increase in the second period. The standard statistics, the standard deviation, sorry, for the sentence years. So what we're gonna do now, we're gonna look at the empirical framework, and I think I have time to show you some of the results. Lionel, stop me if I'm running out of time. But that's our empirical model that is the studies the historical anti-fascism and right voting behavior. Provincial level, YP is the share of right-wing votes in province P in any election year between 48 and 2006. We actually got to 2018. This is our opposition rate. So we can notice here the non-linearity in opposition rates that reflects the equation, the original equation in the model. So what we do, we first estimate this equation by the OLS, and then we use the judge fixed effect as an instrument in the 2SLS model to address causality. So since we have only one instrument, our 2SLS model is linear in opposition rate. So we have an approximation of the non-linear specification that we saw here, that we saw in the model. Here we have some results. So the first thing that we did is we want to check the credibility of our judge fixed effects as an instrument. So we ideally want to use some variables, some covariates, and have no correlation whatsoever. We use the national block vote share and the militia cohort, and the results indicate that our AV is not significantly correlated with these predetermined variables. So this seems to be in line with the random assignment of judges. And we have some results for now.
5 minutes, please, Marco.
Yeah. So the first, almost done. The first are the 1948 general election. Here, the table shows the OLS and the 2SLS results for the election year 1948. Robust standard errors in parentheses and the Conley in square brackets. Consistent with the theoretical model, we have two estimates here, the beta and the sigma. The first is negative, the second is positive, possible concavity in op rate. The second, column 3 and 4, shows the linear specification that provides similar results, so negative. And then we have the 2SLS estimates in column 5 and 6 that we might notice here that twice as large as the one of the OLS. This can be due to two phenomena here. Maybe there's a measurement error in our op rate that produces an attenuation bias in the estimates, or the simultaneity between supply of opposition and demand of repression that creates a negative omitted bias on the OLS estimates. We expect, in fact, to have that the demand of repression will be positively correlated with right voting party and negatively correlated with the opposition rate. These are the results for the 2008 election. So in terms of magnitude, if we look at this and this, we can say that the 2LS coefficient, you get one additional regime opponents every 10,000 dollars in a province in 3543, decreases the support for post-fascist party by more than 0.3 percentage point. If we run this analysis for all the elections, and we consider just the narrow right, so all the parties that were connected to the Partido Nacional Fascista, the column and in the first picture we saw, that's what we get. So all the 2SLS coefficient with covariance 95% confidence interval that ranges from 0.15 to 1.4 in magnitude percentage point. This is our first regression. So as we can see here, we know that the residual judge toughness in 26-34 negatively affect opposition to the regime in 35 and 43. So we can say the past sentences provide a signal to future opponents. We also expanded our conception of right. Instead of just using the narrow right, Oh, sorry, I put an alarm for the 20 minutes. We use a broader definition of narrow rights. So we included parties that didn't have any direct connection to the PNF. So we use Forza Italia and Popolo della Libertà as dependent variable in the election between 94 and 96 and 2018. From 96, negative correlation. Probably in 2008, this effect is very strong because the PDL absorbed other parties that were post-fascist parties. And then we extend this analysis to Fratelli d'Italia, which is the last party that was created. As we can see here, the first stage results are the same, so there's no point in reporting them, but we have a modest negative effect in 2013 election at 90% confidence interval, while we have very small effect in the 2018 election, probably because the FDL shifted more towards a populist party like Lega in Italy. I want to conclude saying that we find in our paper so far that provinces with stronger historical opposition to fascism has significant lower levels of right-wing voters that stem from Mussolini PNF. So like we need to divide here the different parties. There's a similar effect, but smaller magnitude. We conservative or populist party that merged after 94, and namely Forza Italia and Partito della Libertà. There's still a lot of work to do, but thank you so much, and I'm happy to get questions and comments.
Thank you, Marco. Could you just stop your screen share, please? Yep. Who would like to start us off? Florian.
Marco, one nice data set, nice paper. Could I ask a question about the impact of the war itself onto your opposition rate for 35-43? So right now, the war effectively appears in 43 and then kind of so is there any impact that the war might have spatially distinct on that rate as well? So if there is a particular region that basically sends whatever troops to Stalingrad get wiped out in 42, then you might see more opposition in 43 or something like that. So is there any impact on how the war actually shapes what you see? So as in the physical war, that what you see in kind of like your data kind of like structures there. I think your colleague Gary had the impact on judges, like Germany's war effort basically affected like how the judges were basically ruling. Is there something similar, like certain war events might affect how certain provinces are basically reacting?
So you're saying like, what is the impact of the war if there's like on the opposition rate though?
Yeah, so I mean, if you have like 30, I mean, it's obviously if you use the opposition rate 35 to 43, could there be some random spatial correlation that like you have certain judges that are in 27 to 43 are correlated with, for some weird purpose, for some weird reason, with what is happening in the war later on?
I would say no, simply because historically war happened in Italy just in the last 2 years. So although there were winds of war and Mussolini was engaging in war pretty much everywhere, losing every single battle, although that would be something that affect just the military, but like the war wasn't felt in Italy at all until the Americans arrived in Sicily and close to Rome.
I mean, you remove, so sorry if I can just follow up, Lionel. One thing is, I mean, you're removing people. I mean, so it's like I'm not exactly sure how much mobilization there is, but there's a substantial amount of young people that basically gets pulled out of Italy into North Africa, into the Eastern France, I think the Italians are obviously in the Balkans and in Russia. So if you lose, and I'm not exactly sure what the profile, the demographic profile of your, essentially your opposition is, but if essentially it's like you remove kind of a lot more of that age profile, like saying like the 18 to 40-year-old male population, you might essentially either remove more of possible opposition, or you might remove less, or it might trigger more opposition because you have substantially more males disappearing. So I'm not exactly sure whether there's a point there, but it could be a case like that, essentially like the experience of your region in the war might have an impact on the opposition rate, and then later on kind of like the attitude towards fascism as well.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's something that we can definitely look at if we have the military recordings. Yeah, I imagine there will be some effect, especially from 1940 when Italy started truly engaging into wars. Especially because I will say that because we're losing every single battle, that probably had a huge impact on the morale and probably not liking the regime as much. Yeah, this is definitely something to consider and to discuss. Thank you.
Anyone else? Rock. Hi.
Okay, hello. So Marco, first of all, congratulations for an excellent paper, right? I just have basically one quick question, right? So as far as I understood your empirical strategy, so you are using the same strategy as Bonica and Sen, right? Using this kind of random assignment of judges, right? But I would just want to know, so what is there any confounding influence behind the judge fixed effects, right? Because, you know, as we all know, Italy in the post-war period had one of the highest vote shares for the Communist Party, right? So I would just wonder, for example, if you would replace as a form of placebo, right, the judge fixed effects, I don't know, with some exposure to this communist influence after World War II, like you could look at the exposure to Lotta Comunista, or just simply looking at the vote share of the communists, right? Is there any confounding influence? So is there a way that you could rule out, for example, that judge fixed effects, measure of judge toughness does not directly correlate, right, with the exposure, with the prevalence of the voting support for the Communist Party, right? Because that is essentially, because if you look at your map, right, of the judge toughness, right, I have a strong feeling that it correlates quite strongly with the outcome of the referendum after the World War II, you know, referenda sulla forma istituzionale dello Stato, you know, and there, for example, I can see that judges are tougher in the provinces that are more likely to vote for the Republic in the 1948 referendum, right? So again, it's a brilliant empirical strategy, but I would just wonder, right? So is there a way that you could tease out, right, these influences that might correlate at the same time with judge fixed effects, right? But again, wonderful paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments. So you're saying like looking at the referendum, for example, could be an idea to rule out. So we did a placebo test to guard against the spatial autocorrelation. So we inverted the operate periods and the judge fixed effects, and we found no results there. So essentially, this is something that we can consider doing. Actually, the idea of the referendum can be something to run. So the problem would be ideology there. Okay.
Because it's basically, if you're trying to look at the literature, right, on these judicial ideal points that Adam and mine have been writing about for years, right, judges that dissent most strongly, at least what they find for the United States, are also those that are more likely to express their ideological leanings, right, and more likely to dissent, more likely to die from the majority opinion, right? So, I mean, in the case of Italy, because it's very familiar to me, right? I just have a sense that, you know, in the areas, provinces where judges are tougher, right? Somehow this correlates with the presence of judicial ideology, right? I mean, with the presence of some political ideology that they try to express, right? Because the counter, I mean, the only possible critique would be that, I mean, what is in these judge fixed effects, right? So, I don't know, perhaps you can also provide some anecdotal evidence, right, just to make sure what these fixed effects actually are. I mean, is it ideology or is it something else, right?
I think it's probably I should have mentioned in the paper that those judges weren't part of the real panel of judges. Those were military. They were part of the fascist regime. They were coming from the paramilitary force. They were head of the army, head of the navy. They didn't have any judicial background whatsoever. So they weren't really proper judges. There were military that had the card that says, like, I'm a fascist, I want to contribute to the fascist regime as much as I can. So probably they will carry this ideology against socialism and communism, all of them across any spectrum. The differences will be that some of them will be more soft than others, essentially. So the difference is that how would they approach the case, randomly assigned to them. So the idea, so they were all ideologically against any sort of opposition to the regime, no matter what, specifically communism and socialism, because that's what we had at the time. The only differences that we see is how lenient and how severe they were in judging cases as a panel. Does this answer your question a little bit?
Absolutely, yes.
Cool.
Any other questions? Well, Marco, can I just jump in with one?
Sure.
Was just curious about whether you see that there's a link between the work you're doing for this paper and your other work on migration. So I'm just wondering, is there a link between political disposition and the rate at which people migrate?
Yeah, so that was something that I started thinking about the last year. I haven't started working on it because of I needed to focus on this paper first, but looking at the reports from the CIA, apparently there was this push from the American governments to the Italian government to send all the people that were unemployed overseas, because all the people who were unemployed were mathematically communist. So there was this idea, okay, you have a huge amount of communists in Italy, just send them overseas in any single possible country so that they're not going to vote for the Communist Party. Fundamentally, like, the analysis that I had so far is just based on reading documents from the CIA and letters from the head of the government in Italy after World War II and the government in America. And that was part of the reason why Italy received huge amount of funding from the American government was to avoid the rise of the Communist Party, which in Europe, I want to remind everyone, that was the second strongest communist party in the world after Russia. So yeah, that's possibly a next paper to work on political ideology. That would be interesting because it's like a political push migration, I guess, but it's an ongoing idea for now.
Sure.
Thanks,
What was the situation with those who went to Australia?
It's the same. So the idea was, it doesn't matter where you send them, fundamentally. From the paper, you say, we're gonna finance people to go, the Italian government to send people anywhere. So whether that was Brazil, Argentina, United States, or Australia, most of the people that left Italy were from the south, as Dean showed in the map even before, and that was true also after World War II. And the simple reason was they make it easier to, the Italian government made it easier for people to know about possible migration patterns. So like, if you go to Brazil, it's easier there, or, and the idea was we simplify migration in a way that, all the unemployed people can leave Italy and don't vote for the Communist Party. Again, it's not empirically proven yet. It's just an idea, but yeah, possibly working on it.
Good, good. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? Okay. All right. I'd like us all to thank Isabelle, Dean, and Marco. It's terrific to have three such strong papers from people who are just beginning their careers. So we'll watch with interest to see your research evolve, and I hope it's been a helpful experience for the three of you to present. So could we thank our presenters, please? Not the same on a Zoom, and I'd love to continue this chat over coffee and lunch, but we do the best we can. Okay, some housekeeping matters. We're about to have a break until 12 o'clock, and then we have the AGM of the Economic History Society. If you are a member, I please encourage you to attend because we've got some business to transact. If you are not a member, you're welcome to come along as an observer. And of course, if you're not a member, you're most welcome to join for next year. Our next session, we'll hear from Rock and Paul and Claire. That will start at 1:30 Australian Eastern. So for those of you going to the AGM, I'll see you again in a few minutes' time at 12 o'clock. David, do we log out of this session and then go into the next one? Is that right?
Indeed we do, Lionel. We discovered a couple of years ago doing this that it's best to have separate sessions for separate Zoom links for each session. So the AGM link is on the conference program, the final program, and then the session 2 link is a separate link. So please connect to the one that is relevant to the session you want to attend.
Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye.